So, the Porsche Boxster, savior of Porsche, fun, classy daily, and GT3 race car. Well, kinda. Today, in this video, we are going to look at the generations of the Porsche Boxster, and as well, look at the Cayman, which is a little bit of an offshoot from the Boxster, you know, a car that evolved out of it. So, this is going to be a fun one. Let's strap in. Here we go. So first, let's take a look at the Porsche Boxster family tree. Alright, here it is. So there's the first gen Boxster, or the 986. It was produced between 1996 and 2004. The second gen Boxster then follows. It was produced between 2005 and 2012, with two variations of the Boxster, the 987.1 and the 987.2. Now, the 987.2 has a couple of differences, but we'll get into that a little bit later. This is also the generation with a three-door hardtop variant, the Cayman, became a car. This car was also produced in 2012. Next comes the third gen Boxster with the second gen Cayman, produced between 2012 and 2016. Then the fourth and final generation of Boxster so far, as well as the third gen Cayman, produced from 2016 to the present day. So let's take a closer look at each generation and learn a little bit more about what the differences between each generation was. So the first gen Boxster was produced between 1996 and 2004. It was offered with a 5-speed Tiptronic automatic or a 5 and 6-speed options for the manual. They made a lot of these cars, so you can find many of them for super cheap. They make great daily drivers and pretty good track cars, so you'll find a lot of amateur racing series with these cars competing in them. The 986 also managed to save Porsche. If you want to learn more about that, go check out my last video once you're done watching this one. So let's take a look at the engines offered with the 986. The first generation was offered with the 2.5 liter 6-cylinder engine, which I believe was a Boxster engine, hence the name Boxer engine and Boxster the car. This engine had 240 horsepower and 180 foot-pounds of torque, propelling it to 60 in a pretty slow 6.7 seconds. Now, this was not supercar performance, but also you weren't paying supercar prices. This car started at $39,000, where new supercars at the time were selling for easily over $125,000. Now, the top speed of the 2.5 liter base model was 150 miles an hour, which again, not incredibly fast, but still pretty quick for a car with just a 2.5 liter engine and no turbo. It weighed in at 2,775 pounds, which made it a pretty light car and a lot of fun for canyon carving. Now, the 986 had a couple other engine options with this generation. It had the 2.7 liter offered in the Boxster S, which was the souped up version of the Boxster, a little bit faster, had a little bit more oomph to it. The Boxster S was offered from the beginning of the Boxster's lifespan up until the end, but after 2000, the Boxster S was given a little bit of a bump in power and a little bit of a facelift just to make it look a little bit better and perform a little bit better as well. Both versions of the Boxster S had a 2.7 liter engine, with the pre-2000s making 220 horsepower and 191 foot-pounds of torque, pushing it to 60 in 6.1 seconds, with a top speed of 157 miles an hour and a little bit of gained weight at 2,910 pounds. The post-2000s Boxster had the same 2.7 liter engine with a little bit of an upgrade. It was now pushing 260 horsepower and 228 foot-pounds of torque, which brought it up to 60 in a quick 5.5 seconds, with the top speed being 164 miles an hour and the car weighing 2,910 pounds. Now next up was the second gen, or the 967, produced between 2005 and 2012. Now, this car had a fairly long lifespan, so it was split halfway down the generation between the 987.1 and the 987.2. Now, we'll talk about some of the differences between the half generation split later, but right now, let's look at a couple differences between the 986 and the 987. First off, the 987 had no spare tire, whereas the 986 did, which is kind of weird. Another downgrade that happened between the 2 years was that the 987 moved to a fully virtual oil stick, which is really weird. I mean, if you're in a sports car, you want to be able to check the oil because otherwise you're gonna have a problem. And the only way to check the oil was to pull the oil out of the car, drain it, and get an oil change. Which, not great design by Porsche, contrary to what they usually do. Now, the two cars, despite being only a couple of years apart, they look quite different. The 987 looks a lot more like a classic 911 than the 986 did. It's less of an original design in my opinion, and looks a lot more like you would expect a Porsche sports car to look like. Now, one upgrade from the 986 to the 987 was the introduction of the Porsche Cayman, which is a 3-door hardtop variant that turned into a GT3 car eventually, but again, we'll get to that in a couple of minutes. One other real upgrade from the 986 to the 987 was direct port injection. This helped the car run smoother and just idle a little bit better. Now, the 987 was offered with 4 engine options, a 2.7, a 2.9, a 3.2, and a 3.4. Now, the 2.7 liter engine in the 987.1 cranked out 245 horsepower and 201 foot-pounds of torque. This brought the car to 60 in 6.1 seconds, which is pretty respectable. Definitely an improvement over the last base model, by just more than half a second, which is pretty good improvement if you ask me. The car's top speed was increased to 160 miles an hour over 150 in the last base model, which is also a pretty good increase. But the car gained a little bit of weight, going from about 2,900 pounds to about 3,040 pounds, which, not great, but definitely not the end of the world either. Now the 2.9 engine cranked out 252 horsepower. Not an insane increase, but definitely a bit more than before, which helps it, as we'll see with the performance numbers. But it also had 213 foot-pounds of torque, which is quite a bit more than the 2.7 offered. This pushed the car to 60 in 5.9 seconds versus the 6.1 seconds for the 2.7 engine. This also pushed the car to a top speed of 163 miles an hour. Now, the bigger engine put on about 60 pounds, with the car now weighing 3,100 pounds. Now, in just a second, we're going to look at the 987.2, but first, let's look at some of the differences between the two cars. The 987.2 got a bit of a facelift, and I think it looks so much better than the 987.1. It looks almost like a baby 918 Spider to me, if you know what I mean. Now, along with better looks, it had better engines, giving a little bit of a power increase. Now, the 987.2 also brought a couple of special editions, such as the Black Edition and the Spider, with the Spider being the best looking Boxster yet. One other great thing about the 987.2 was that most 987.2s came without the IMS bearing, which I don't know everything about these cars, and I can't tell you exactly what the IMS bearing does, but what I do know is that without that, the reliability of the cars drastically improved, as the IMS bearing was a huge flaw in Porsches of that era. Now, the 3.2 liter variant offered in the 987.2 Boxster S put out quite a bit more power, 276 horsepower to be exact, accompanied by 236 foot-pounds of torque. These launched the car to 60 in 5.5 seconds. The top speed now reaching 167 miles an hour, going down to 2,965 pounds. Now, the pre-2009 3.4 engines cranked out a solid 291 horsepower along with 250 foot-pounds of torque. This pushed the car to 60 in 5.4 seconds with a top speed of 169 miles an hour. But the car weighed 3,150 pounds, being the heaviest Boxster yet. The post-2009 3.4 liter Boxster had a bit of a power uptick as well, hitting 306 horsepower, the first Boxster to break the 300 horsepower mark, along with 265 foot-pounds of torque. This pushed the car to 60 in 5.3 seconds, again, the fastest Boxster to this point, with a top speed of 170 miles an hour. Again, the fastest Boxster to this point. Now, this car was quite quick, even though it was also on the heavier side, weighing the same as the pre-2009 3.4 engines at, again, 3,150 pounds. But always good, it was still a really great car. Now, the 987C, or the Cayman. Some differences between the Cayman and the Boxster were, for one, the biggest difference, the fact that it has a hardtop. This made it eligible to compete in many more racing series, including the GT4 class, which this car will get into next generation. Now, the Cayman also had the same engine options as the Boxster, as they were siblings, except one weird thing was that the Cayman always had 10 more horsepower than the same engines found in the Boxster, which I think is pretty weird and a little bit unfair. Now, even though they did get 10 more horsepower, they all weighed slightly more due to the hard top, because, well, having a hunk of metal there does weigh the car down quite a bit, but all is well. Now, many smaller amateur racing series fielded this car as a race car, but it wasn't quite ready for GT4 yet. Porsche still felt that they had a little bit more development to do, so they kept working on it. We see the car make its way into GT4 with the next generation. Now, bear with me, these numbers are kind of weird. Not the horsepower numbers or anything, but just the way that Porsche decided to name the car. See, it goes 986, 987, 981, and then 982. It's kind of weird that they go back with numbers, with the generations, but, bear with me, it is what it is. It's not my fault, it's Porsche's. Anyway, the third gen 981, quite a few improvements over the 987. But not just performance upgrades. No, actually, Porsche focused a little bit more on the consumer of the car and gave the interior quite a couple of upgrades as well, making it feel much more spacious and a lot roomier, as well as just nicer. Although one downside to that is that there's hardly any storage space, with none in the center console. Now, one change was that it had some kind of weird power steering. Now, you can look at this as either good or bad. If you're the typical Boxster customer, 45 to 65-year-old midlife crisis man, you're probably going to want something a little bit smoother to drive your wife around in, and something that can be a good daily car, not a full track car, just like the 987 and 986, which felt a lot like go-karts compared to this car. This car's power steering was pretty mushy, but it stiffens up as you get faster. So again, look at it how you will. For performance enthusiasts, it's not quite an improvement, rather a downgrade, but for the average Joe, it's a bit of an upgrade. One other upgrade that Porsche added, and this is kind of a fun fact, is that you can set the car to beep at you when you exceed a certain speed. So if you don't want to go to jail, it's a fun little fact, you can turn that on in the 981 and the 982. Now for the specs. This car was offered with a 7-speed Tiptronic automatic or a 6-speed manual. Thank you, Porsche, for keeping the manuals alive. It's a big deal to us car guys. Now, the base model, the 2.7 liter flat 6, pushed out 261 horsepower and 206 foot-pounds of torque, pushing the car to 60 in a noticeably improved 5.8 seconds, with a top speed of 164 miles an hour, and weighing in at 3,050 pounds. Now, one thing to note is that these engines were paired with a better exhaust, drastically improving the sound of the cars, which, is kind of a big deal for the car enthusiasts because it just makes the car more fun to drive. It makes it more of an experience. Now, the Boxster S was given a 3.4 liter flat 6, pushing out 311 horsepower and 265 foot-pounds torque, pushing the car to 60 in a pretty respectable 5.1 seconds, with the top speed of the car being 173 miles an hour and the car weighing in at 3,080 pounds. Now, the Porsche Cayman was given the same engine options with also 10 more horsepower for each engine. Again, kind of weird, but it was also given the GT4 package with a 3.8 liter flat six, pushing out 380 horsepower and 309 foot-pounds of torque, pushing the car to 60 in 4.4 seconds. This car had a top speed of 183 miles an hour, which is pretty stinking fast for one of these cars. This car also shed some weight, weighing in at 2,955 pounds. Now, this was the first generation of the Boxster, or should I say Cayman, that raced in the GT4 class, and it did pretty well. So well, in fact, that it swept the 2013 Rolex 24 Hours at Daytona. Now, a couple more upgrades that this car got over the 987 was it had way better brakes, like significantly better brakes. The car also performed better in a straight line and around the curves, but some buyers who I reached out to online have said that the biggest improvement they noticed in the driving were the brakes. They were significantly better. This car also really looks like a baby 918. I like it, others tend to not love it so much. Anyway, onto the fourth generation, the 982, or more commonly known as the 718. This car was produced from 2016 to today. Now, some fun facts about this generation was it was the first Boxster / Cayman with a turbo. It was also the most reliable Boxster so far, with less cars breaking down within the first 50,000 miles than ever before. Now, the 718 nameplate that everybody knows it by is actually a tribute to an old race car that beat cars with more power and better engine figures. The 718 also has more luggage space than you would expect. It's got a frunk and it's got a little bit of a trunk in the back. So it's a really good car for hauling stuff around. I mean, you'd be surprised. Now, this car was offered with 3 engine options: a 2.0 liter turbo flat 4, a 2.5 liter turbo flat 4, and a 4.0 liter naturally aspirated flat 6. So let's look at the performance of each of these cars. The base model 2 liter flat 4 put out 247 horsepower and 229 foot-pounds of torque, with a 0 to 60 in 5.4 seconds. The car's top speed was 162 miles an hour, and it weighed in at 2,940 pounds, losing weight from the last generation. Now, the Boxster T, paired with the same engine, but a little bit hopped up, made 296 horsepower and 280 foot-pounds of torque, pushing it to 60 in 4.7 seconds with a top speed of 171 miles per hour. This car weighed 2,940 pounds as well. Now, a fun fact about the T is that the T does not stand for turbo, but rather touring, which is a little bit interesting. You would have expected to mean turbo, but no. Another fun fact is that the S and the T variants have no infotainment system, but only in Europe, which is a little bit weird to me, but still kind of cool. It really shows that this car was focused more on track and racing rather than focused on being a comfortable car that was made to go get groceries. Now, the Boxster S had a 2.5 liter turbo flat 4, pushing out 345 horsepower and 310 foot-pounds of torque, bringing the car up to 60 miles an hour in 4.7 seconds. The top speed of the car was 171 miles an hour, and the car weighed in at 2,290 pounds, just 30 pounds more than the 2.0 liter Boxsters. Now, the Boxster GTS was paired with the 2.5 liter flat 4 as well, but it made 360 horsepower and 317 foot-pounds of torque, bringing the car up to 60 just 0.1 seconds faster at 4.1 seconds, and bringing it to a top speed of 180 miles an hour. The car also weighed 3,030 pounds. One thing I think is super cool about the 2.5 liter engine is that it uses a variable turbo. Now, instead of using a twin turbo, which takes up more space and weighs more, Porsche decided to design a variable turbo, meaning the turbocharger changes its compression on the context, which is really interesting. Basically, mechanical vanes in the turbo can change their angle depending on how much boost you need. So at lower RPMs, you can still have boost, and because of this, you kind of get rid of the turbo lag that is associated with having a turbo. And at higher RPMs, valves open up to accommodate the higher exhaust flow, giving the car more boost. So this is a great system designed by Porsche that makes the car feel a lot quicker than it really should be, which is really cool that Porsche is able to design something like that. Now, the Boxster GTS 4.0. Offered with a 4 liter, as the name suggests, flat 6. This car makes 395 horsepower, just 5 shy of that 400 horsepower mark, along with 310 foot-pounds of torque, which is a lot lower than you would expect. Now, that all brought this car to 60 in 4 seconds. It also had a top speed of 182 miles an hour and weighed 3,030 pounds. Now, the Cayman GT4 RS. This car has the same 4 liter flat 6 as the GT4 race cars, pushing out 493 horsepower and 332 foot-pounds of torque, bringing the car to 60 in a very respectable 3.4 seconds, and a top speed of 196 miles an hour, weighing the car in at 3,300 pounds. Now, this is where the Cayman and Boxster turn into a bit of a supercar slinger. This Boxster GT4 RS can outperform almost any supercar from the early 2000s and mid-2000s where this car originated, which is kind of insane seeing how far the Boxster has come. It started off as a cheap, reliable production car that the everyday man could afford. If you had enough money to buy a new Toyota, then you had enough money to buy this Boxster. And it was an everyday man's Porsche, something unlike Porsche had really done before. giving a high quality car to everyday people. Now, about the next gen Boxster, it'll probably be a hybrid given the situation, or maybe even a full EV, but we can cross our fingers that it doesn't happen. Either way, it'll probably still have a manual, as Porsche has developed a manual gearbox for electric cars. Because of the electric motors that it might end up having, it'll probably have more power and more torque, making it faster than any car before. Although hybrid and electric systems do tend to add a bunch of weight, so it may lose a little bit of its handling characteristics. Now, one final fact that I found pretty interesting about the 4th gen Boxster is that you can actually take the entire headlight assembly out with just one tool. It's pretty cool. I don't know why I found it interesting, but it was something that I just thought was pretty cool. Now, real quick, I just want to say thank you to some people who helped me find some interesting facts about this car. One person in particular, go check out his Instagram. It's Evan Langley on Instagram. I'll put a link in the description. Thanks so much to him for giving me some of these fun facts that I've used in this video. Now, the Boxster is a great car. As I said earlier, it was Porsche's attempt at an everyday driver's car. And, you know, today it outclasses and outdrives every car that it was meant to compete with. The Z4, the MX-5, all of those, this car hands their butts to them on a silver platter. The Boxster has really changed the racing scene, and it saved Porsche, so we have a lot to thank this car for, even though it's not the car that everybody thinks of when you think of Porsche. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching today's video. If you want to learn about how the Boxster saved Porsche, take a look at my last video. And as always, catch you guys next time. Love ya!